Every morning, something inside the Mafia Boss's bedroom had moved. A lamp angled slightly differently. Curtains left partially open. A water glass closer to the bed than where he remembered leaving it the night before. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anyone else inside the mansion would notice. Which made it worse. Because the changes were small enough to make a man question himself before he questioned anyone around him. At first, the Mafia Boss thought exhaustion was affecting his memory. That was the explanation everyone else preferred too. Stress. Too many meetings. Too many years without real sleep. The doctors told him to rest. Security increased patrols around the West Wing. His younger brother quietly started handling more conversations during business dinners. Nobody said he was becoming unstable. But slowly, people started speaking to him more carefully, as if they were already preparing for something inside him to break. And every night after midnight, the room changed again. A lamp angled slightly differently. Curtains left partially open. A water glass moved closer to the bed. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anyone else would notice. Which made it worse. Because the changes were small enough to make a man question himself before he questioned anyone around him. And after weeks without proper sleep, even he started wondering if the problem was inside his own mind, until the night the housemaid noticed the bedroom slippers. One had been facing the door. Now both of them faced the bed. She stood there quietly in the hallway outside his room, while rain pressed against the tall windows of the mansion. Inside, the Mafia Boss was still awake. The bedside lamp cast a tired amber light across the room. And for a few long seconds, neither of them spoke. Then he looked at her and asked the same question nobody else in the mansion had taken seriously. Did someone come in here last night? And for the first time, she did not immediately say no. The housemaid's name was Elena. In that mansion, most people did not use it. To the guards, she was staff. To the family, she was part of the background. To the guests who came through the west entrance in tailored coats and quiet fear, she was someone who lowered her eyes and disappeared before conversations turned dangerous. That was what made her useful. Nobody guarded their face around a woman they did not think could matter. Elena had worked the night rotation for almost 8 months. She knew the rhythm of the estate better than most of the men paid to protect it. She knew which doors softened when the rain came, which marble steps echoed too loudly after midnight, and which security guard always cleared his throat before turning the corner. The mansion had rules, but it also had habits. Habits were harder to fake. The Mafia Boss kept his room almost painfully ordered. His books were stacked with their spines aligned to the edge of the table. His cufflinks stayed in a shallow black tray near the mirror. His medication remained beside the water glass. Never close enough to spill. Never far enough to forget. His slippers sat beside the bed, always facing the door. Everything in his room stayed exactly where he left it. So when the slippers changed direction, Elena did not answer him immediately. She looked once at the floor, then at the bed, then at the lamp. The lamp was wrong too. Not by much. Just a few inches turned toward the window instead of the chair. A person who did not clean that room every night would have seen nothing. Elena saw enough. The Mafia Boss watched her from the edge of the bed. He was still dressed in yesterday's shirt. The collar open. His sleeves rolled to the forearm. He looked less like a man who could order violence, and more like a man who had been waiting for morning to forgive him. "You saw it," he said quietly. It was not a question. Elena kept her hands folded around the fresh towels. "I saw the slippers moved." His expression did not change, but something in his shoulders lowered. Not relief. Only the smallest release of a man who had been holding his breath too long. Security says no one entered. She glanced toward the hallway, where the cameras were hidden behind dark glass and polished corners. Maybe they didn't see anyone. That is not the same thing. "No," she said. "It isn't." He looked at her longer after that. Not with suspicion. With caution, as if trust itself had become expensive. and he no longer knew whether he could afford even a small piece of it. Elena should have left the room. That was the safest thing. A housemaid did not question security inside a mafia estate, but his fear was not loud. It was precise. That made it harder to dismiss. She placed the towels on the side chair and moved through the room carefully. She did not touch anything at first. She only looked. The curtains had been drawn before dinner. She remembered because the rain had started early. And she had closed them herself after bringing in a fresh blanket from the warmer. Now the left curtain hung open by the width of 2 fingers. Enough for the city lights to slip through and fall across the floor. The water glass had moved too. Not far. But it was no longer aligned with the edge of the nightstand. The medication bottle beside it had turned slightly, label facing outward. Elena felt her pulse slow in that strange way fear sometimes does when it becomes useful. "Did you move the medicine?" she asked. "No." "Did the doctor?" "He came before midnight. I was awake." "Security. They don't enter unless I call." She nodded, but did not look convinced. He noticed that too. Elena. It was the first time he had said her name. The sound of it in his voice made the room feel smaller. She turned. "Do you think I'm imagining this?" There were several safe answers. She could have said he was tired. She could have said stress changes memory. She could have said she was only a maid and it was not her place. Instead, she looked at the slippers again. "No," she said. "I think someone wants you to." For a moment, nothing moved in the room except the rain shifting against the glass. The mafia boss lowered his eyes. Not in weakness. In recognition. Because the sentence had touched the exact wound nobody else had named. "Someone wants you to." That was worse than someone entering. A stranger entering his room would have been a threat. This required patience, access, and knowledge of his habits. By morning, the house looked normal again. The floors shone. The silver trays returned to their places. The guards stood straight near the entrances. Coffee steamed in porcelain cups. The family dining room filled with low voices and careful manners. The mafia boss did not come down. His younger brother, Victor, sat one seat to the right of the head of the long table, close enough to manage conversation, far enough to pretend respect. Elena passed behind the room with a tray of folded linens and noticed who looked at the empty chair. Almost everyone did. Almost no one looked worried. That stayed with her. Later, near the service corridor, she heard the physician speaking quietly with the head of security. "He needs uninterrupted sleep," the doctor said. The head of security replied, "He refuses to sleep. That is not the same as being unable to." "No, but either way, it becomes a problem." The words were calm. That made them worse. Not cruel. Not panicked. Administrative. As if the mafia boss's fear had already become a matter to be managed. That afternoon, Elena cleaned his room again. Not because it needed cleaning, because she needed to know whether morning light made the night seem foolish. It did not. The left curtain still carried a faint crease from where it had been held open. The rug near the bed showed a slight pressure mark. Not where he usually stood, but closer to the window side. The water glass had left a ring on the nightstand 1/2 inch away from its usual place. Small things. Quiet things. The kind of evidence that could disappear under the hand of anyone impatient. Elena did not move them. She only memorized them. That night, she began watching differently. She did not spy. She did not search drawers or follow guards or enter rooms where she had no reason to be. She stayed inside her duties. That was the safest way to notice danger. She replaced towels outside the west wing at 11, collected laundry at midnight, polished the small table near the hallway mirror at 1. Each time, she passed the bedroom door, at 1:40. She saw the mafia boss sitting in the chair by the window, still awake, one hand resting against his mouth. The lamp beside him was low. His eyes were open, fixed not on the city, but on the reflection of the room in the glass. A man who watched windows that way was not looking outside. He was watching behind him. Elena lowered her gaze and continued down the hall. She understood something then. He was not afraid of being attacked. He was afraid of falling asleep. There was a difference. An attack came once. Sleep required surrender, and he no longer believed the room would remain the same after he closed his eyes. A doi cincis presece. She returned for the laundry cart. The bedroom door was still shut. The guard at the corner was new for that hour. Young, too polished, too alert in the wrong way. He watched her pass. Not with interest. With measurement. Late rotation, he asked. I always work late rotation. He smiled a little, as if he had meant nothing by it. By 3. The hall had emptied. The rain stopped. Elena stood in the service alcove with a stack of folded sheets and waited until the young guard turned the corner. Then she looked at the floor outside the Mafia Boss's room. The carpet showed nothing. Of course it showed nothing. Everything in that mansion had been chosen to soften movement and erase disturbance, but the brass handle on the bedroom door held a faint mark near the base. Not a fingerprint, only a dullness where polished metal should have caught the light. Elena felt cold move under her skin. She had cleaned that handle herself before midnight. When the door opened from inside, he held the handle higher. He always did. This mark was lower. Someone else's hand. She stood there for 1 second too long. Then the voice behind her said, "You should not be here." Elena turned. The young guard had come back without his radio making a sound. His face remained polite. That was the worst part. She held the folded sheets closer to her chest. "I'm changing the West Room linens." At 3 a.m, the doctor said the boss needs clean bedding. The lie was small enough to survive. The guard looked at the bedroom door, then back at her. For a moment, Elena thought he might ask another question. Instead, he stepped aside. "Then be quick." She lowered her head and entered the room. The Mafia Boss was awake. Of course he was. He sat in the chair by the window, still in the same position. Except now his eyes were on her. "You found something," he said. Elena closed the door behind her. Quietly. She did not tell him about the handle first. She looked at the floor. The slippers were exactly where they had been left, facing the door. The lamp was angled correctly. The curtains were closed. The water glass sat aligned with the edge of the table. For the first time since he had asked her the question, everything looked right. That should have calmed her. It did not, because the room looked too carefully restored, and careful restoration was not the same as innocence. Elena turned back to him. Outside the door, the hallway remained silent. Inside the room, the Mafia Boss waited for her answer with the stillness of a man who had learned not to hope too loudly. She spoke softly. "Tonight, someone cleaned up after themselves." After that night, Elena stopped looking at the mansion as a place. She started looking at it as a system. The West Wing operated differently from the rest of the estate. Everyone knew that. The guards rotated more frequently there. Deliveries were checked twice. Visitors waited longer before entering. Even the staff lowered their voices automatically near that side of the building. But now Elena began noticing something else. The routines around the Mafia Boss were becoming inconsistent. Not chaotic. Controlled. 3 nights earlier, the same 2 guards had covered the west corridor from midnight until dawn. Last night, the younger guard had appeared after 2 a.m. without explanation. The night before that, security changed patrol timing twice within a single hour. Even though the estate almost never altered schedules unless there was an outside threat, there had been no outside threat. Everything dangerous was happening inside the house. Elena realized that while folding linens in the downstairs laundry room, 2 housekeepers stood nearby speaking quietly over pressed shirts and steam. "He barely came downstairs yesterday. He looks exhausted. The doctor says it's stress. The doctor says that every week, one of the women noticed Elena listening and lowered her voice further. You work near the West Wing. Is it true he's checking the locks himself now? Elena continued folding. I don't know. The answer disappointed them. People inside rich houses loved fear, as long as it belonged to someone else. By evening, rain returned to the city again. Headlights moved beyond the gates. Radios crackled near the entrance hall. Men in dark coats crossed polished floors carrying umbrellas and sealed folders. At a little past 10, she brought fresh towels to the West Wing and noticed the hallway camera above the elevator had gone dark. Not broken. Inactive. The tiny red recording light was off. She slowed slightly. A guard near the stairwell noticed her looking. Maintenant c'est sûr, he said immediately. Too quickly. Elena nodded and kept walking. When people told the truth inside that mansion, they usually sounded tired. Only lies arrived prepared. She continued toward the Mafia Boss's room. Tonight, the corridor felt watched. Not by cameras. By people waiting to see who noticed things. When Elena entered the bedroom suite, the Mafia Boss was standing near the shelves by the fireplace. Reading through documents he clearly had not absorbed. His eyes moved across the pages without focus. He looked up when she entered, then immediately looked toward the hallway behind her. The camera outside the elevator is off, she said quietly. His expression changed before he answered. Very slightly. But enough. You checked, I noticed. How long, I don't know. He set the papers down slowly. That camera has backup power. Elena felt pressure settle deeper into the room. Not panic. Recognition. Real fear rarely arrives through surprises. Usually it arrives when suspicions begin confirming each other. She placed the towels beside the bathroom door. Security said maintenance. They always say something. The sentence came out flat. Exhausted. Not angry. That stayed with her more than anger would have. A man shouting still believed he had control. A man speaking quietly had often started losing it. The Mafia Boss crossed toward the window and looked down at the front drive below. Rain slid across the glass behind his reflection. Elena. She turned. If this continues. He stopped there. Not because he lacked words. Because he already knew the ending he feared. She understood it anyway. If this continued, people would stop trusting his judgment. Maybe some already had. The realization passed between them without needing to be spoken aloud. Until recently, their conversations had stayed careful and practical. But fear changes the way people speak, when politeness no longer protects them. A knock came at the outer door. 3 measured taps. The Mafia Boss straightened immediately. The expression disappeared from his face so quickly it almost frightened Elena more than the fear itself. Come in. The head of security entered. Calm and composed. Carrying a tablet in one hand. Rainwater darkened the shoulders of his black coat. Sorry to disturb you, he said. We had a vehicle stop outside the north gate for approximately 4 minutes. False alarm. The Mafia Boss nodded once. And the camera? The head of security looked toward the hallway briefly before answering. Temporary outage. Already being restored. How temporary 23 minutes. 23 minutes. Not rounded. Not estimated. Exact. Elena noticed the Mafia Boss catch that too. People who lied casually rarely measured time. Precisely, the head of security continued. There was no unauthorized movement inside the estate. No unauthorized movement. The wording settled strangely in Elena's mind. Not no movement. No unauthorized movement. The Mafia Boss stepped closer. And how would you know that if the camera was down? The head of security hesitated. Barely. But enough. We had personnel covering the corridor. Which personnel? The midnight rotation. The same rotation that changed twice this week. Nobody answered immediately. Elena lowered her eyes automatically. But she could feel the pressure shifting between the two men. This was not confrontation. It was professional trust beginning to fracture. The head of security answered carefully. We adjusted schedules because of your recent concerns. My concerns? The mafia boss repeated softly. The phrase sounded wrong in the room. It reduced something intimate into administration. Elena suddenly understood why the mafia boss had stopped sleeping. It was not only the intrusions. It was the way every explanation around him quietly transformed fear into symptom. Stress. Exhaustion. Concerns. Words designed to soften reality until nobody had to admit something dangerous was happening. The head of security eventually left. The mafia boss stared at the hallway for several seconds. He used to argue with me, he said. Elena looked at him. When something was wrong, he continued. He used to argue. Now the head of security spoke too carefully, too smoothly, like a man walking around fragile glass. That frightened him more. Fear inside criminal organizations was easy to recognize. Caution was harder. Elena moved toward the side table to straighten the untouched papers he had abandoned earlier. As she aligned the edges, she noticed something else. The document beneath the top folder was upside down. Not accidentally. The mafia boss always organized paperwork facing the chair. Always. Someone had handled the stack while standing on the opposite side of the desk. She did not mention it immediately. Every new detail no longer answered questions. It multiplied them. Later that night, the physician arrived again. Elena passed him near the elevator while carrying fresh tea toward the office level. You're still awake? He asked kindly. Night shift. No, he said gently. I meant him. The physician looked tired. Not dishonest. Just tired in the way men become tired after repeating reassurances they no longer fully believe themselves. He needs rest, the doctor murmured. Without sleep, the mind starts creating patterns where there are none. Elena almost answered. Part of her still wanted the doctor to be right. It would have been easier if exhaustion explained everything. But she remembered the dark camera, the changed patrols, the polished answers, and the restored room. Instead, she lowered her gaze slightly and continued down the corridor. Because the deeper the nights became inside that mansion, the more dangerous certainty started feeling. By the following week, the mafia boss stopped pretending he intended to sleep. The bedroom changed because of it. The bed remained untouched most nights. The sheets still smooth by morning, except for one side slightly folded where he sat instead of lay down. The lamp stayed on until dawn. Half-finished coffee replaced the water beside his medication. Files accumulated across the desk because exhaustion had started interfering with the order he once maintained. Elena found him awake almost every night now. Sometimes in the chair by the window, sometimes near the fireplace. Once standing motionless in the dark hallway outside his own room at nearly 4 a.m. One hand resting against the wall as if he had forgotten where he intended to go. He did not look embarrassed when she saw him. Embarrassment required energy. This was beyond that. You should sleep, she told him quietly. He gave a tired smile without humor. That advice has become very popular lately. Elena adjusted the linens in her arms. The doctor worries. The doctor worries professionally. And the others? He looked down the empty corridor before answering. The others worry structurally. The sentence stayed with her long after he returned inside the room. That same night, Elena began noticing another pattern. The guards outside the West Wing no longer behaved like men protecting someone dangerous. They behaved like men waiting for something. Protective men scanned outward. Waiting men kept checking inward. She saw it near 1:30 while polishing the hallway console beneath the painting outside the office corridor. 2 guards stood near the elevator, speaking in low voices. The moment the bedroom door opened slightly behind them, both men turned immediately. Not alarmed. Prepared. The mafia boss stepped out only far enough to look down the hall before retreating inside again. Neither guard moved after him. Neither asked if he needed anything. They simply watched the door until it closed. Elena kept polishing the table long after it no longer needed polishing. The mansion had started adapting to his insomnia. Not solving it, adapting to it. The next evening, Victor arrived earlier than usual. The younger brother rarely raised his voice inside the estate. He moved through rooms with the calm confidence of someone who understood how dangerous loud men looked to outsiders. During business dinners, he listened more than he spoke. That made people underestimate how closely he watched everything. Elena passed him in the lower hallway while carrying fresh towels upstairs. "Late again?" he asked politely. "Yes. Sir, you work too much." The comment sounded harmless. Still, his eyes lingered too long on the west wing behind her. Not suspicion. Assessment. As though he were quietly measuring how much she had begun noticing. When Elena entered the Mafia Boss's room later that night, she found him sitting at the desk with several security reports spread open before him. Unread. He was staring instead at the reflection in the dark window beside the desk lamp. "The patrol changed again," he said before she spoke. Elena set the towels down. "You noticed, too." His expression shifted slightly at the wording. "Too." That single word carried more comfort than reassurance would have. "Yes," he said quietly. He picked up one of the reports and held it loosely between his fingers. "They changed West Corridor rotation 3 times tonight. Did security explain why?" "They stopped trying to explain things clearly." He leaned back slowly, rubbing one hand across his eyes. For the first time since Elena had known him, he looked older than his reputation. Not weaker, just worn down in places nobody else was meant to see. "Elena." She looked toward him. "When did you start believing me?" The question caught her off guard because of the way he asked it. Carefully, like a man asking something that mattered more than it should. She considered lying for a moment. Telling him she always believed him would have sounded kinder. But kindness built on dishonesty rarely survives pressure. When the room started changing back, he stayed quiet. "The first nights," she continued, "someone moved things." She looked toward the lamp near the bed. "But now they put them back, exactly how you left them." His eyes narrowed slightly. "And that matters because fear stopped being enough." Elena stepped closer to the desk, lowering her voice despite the closed doors. "At first, someone wanted you confused. Now they want you uncertain whether confusion ever happened." He looked at her for several seconds without answering. And in those seconds, something between them shifted permanently. Not trust fully formed. Something quieter. The beginning of reliance. Everyone else in the mansion kept trying to reduce his fear into exhaustion. Elena was the first person trying to understand its logic. That steadied him more than comfort would have come. "I haven't slept more than 2 hours in 6 days," he said. The admission came without drama. Simple. Which made it heavier. Elena looked at the untouched bed. "Do you think they'll stop?" "No." The answer arrived immediately. "Not emotional." "Certain." She realized then that his fear had already moved beyond intrusion. He no longer feared one person entering the room. He feared what prolonged exhaustion would eventually turn him into beaniness. The desk phone rang suddenly. Both of them looked toward it. Not startled. Conditioned. The Mafia Boss answered after the second ring. "Yes." A pause. Then another. His expression flattened slowly during the conversation. "I understand." He hung up without explanation. Elena waited. "Victor moved tomorrow's meeting," he said at last. "Why, he says I need rest." The room became quiet in a different way. Not because the statement sounded threatening, because it sounded reasonable. The Mafia Boss stood and crossed toward the window again. Rain had stopped hours ago, leaving the city below wet with reflected light. "When people begin protecting you from your own responsibilities," he said quietly, "they've already started imagining the world without you in charge." Elena watched him in silence. She understood now why this felt different from ordinary betrayal. Nobody was openly turning against him. Nobody was challenging him directly. The mansion was simply adjusting. Small schedule changes, different conversations, careful wording, reduced responsibilities. People around him behaving gently enough that the loss of authority almost resembled concern. A soft knock interrupted the room. The physician entered carrying a small black medical case. He looked relieved to see Elena there. "You're still awake," the doctor said carefully. The mafia boss gave a tired glance toward the untouched bed. "That appears to be the central issue." The physician approached slowly. "I'd like to adjust the medication." "No. It may help you rest. It may help me stop noticing things." The physician hesitated. "You need sleep. I need certainty." The doctor lowered his voice. "With respect, exhaustion can create patterns that feel real." The mafia boss's jaw tightened slightly. "Not anger. Fatigue." Then something unexpected happened. He looked toward Elena, instead of answering the doctor. Only briefly, but long enough for the physician to notice, and in that moment, Elena realized the emotional balance inside the room had changed. The mafia boss no longer trusted reassurance automatically. He trusted observation. The physician saw it too. A small shadow crossed his face before he masked it again professionally. "I'll return tomorrow," he said quietly, after he left. Neither Elena nor the mafia boss spoke for a while. The silence between them no longer felt formal. It felt occupied. Eventually, Elena moved toward the bedside table to replace the cold coffee. As she lifted the cup, she noticed the medication bottle beside it, turned outward again, perfectly aligned, exactly the same way it had been before. She froze, not because the bottle moved, because she suddenly realized something worse. Whoever entered the room understood his habits now almost as well as she did. Elena stopped thinking of the West Wing as protected. Protected spaces did not require so much careful explanation. Over the next several nights, she began noticing that the camera outages followed a pattern. Not random failures. Not weather interference. Timing. The hallway camera near the elevator went dark, only during specific windows between 1 and 3 in the morning. Never earlier. Never during shift changes when senior staff still moved through the upper corridors, and never long enough to trigger formal concern. Just enough. Long enough for uncertainty to survive without becoming scandal. The realization settled into her during a quiet Thursday night, while she stood in the downstairs service office replacing inventory sheets. She had written the outage times accidentally at first. Then intentionally. Monday. 1, 7-139. Tuesday. 1-4-2-203. Wednesday. 1-2-6151. Each outage aligned almost perfectly with altered West Wing patrol routes. Elena stared at the paper for a long moment, before folding it carefully into the pocket of her apron. Not evidence. Just pattern. And patterns inside that mansion had begun feeling more dangerous than facts. That same night, the mafia boss remained inside his office instead of the bedroom. The office light stayed on past 2 in the morning, casting warm gold through the glass partition into the empty hallway outside. Elena passed twice with fresh coffee trays for the conference rooms downstairs, and noticed him sitting motionless behind the desk each time. Not working. Listening. As if silence itself had become suspicious. When she entered near 3 to collect empty cups, he looked more alert than rested men usually did. "You changed your routine," she said quietly. "I changed the room. That won't stop them." "No," he agreed. "But I wanted to know whether they follow me or the bedroom." The sentence chilled her more than she expected. He had started testing the mansion back. Elena set the tray down slowly, and his eyes shifted briefly toward the office door. The camera outside this hallway went down tonight, too. For the first time since all of this began, Elena felt something move fully from suspicion into certainty. Not emotional certainty. Procedural certainty. Someone was shaping the blind spots intentionally. The mafia boss leaned back in the chair, studying her expression carefully. You already knew. It was not accusation. Recognition. Elena removed the folded paper from her apron pocket and placed it on the desk. He unfolded it slowly. Read the outage times once. Then again. Nobody spoke. You tracked this yourself. I noticed it before I understood it. And now Elena looked toward the dark office windows where the city reflected back at them in fractured lights. Now I think someone only wants certain parts of the mansion unseen. He lowered the paper carefully onto the desk. The security logs will show maintenance. He said, They already do. You checked, I listen. The emotional distance between them had narrowed, so gradually Elena almost had not noticed it happening. Weeks ago, she would have avoided speaking this directly to him. Now she found herself watching his reactions, the same way she watched the room itself. For changes, for hidden pressure, for the exact moment, exhaustion began overtaking judgment. He stood suddenly and crossed toward the office door. Elena. She looked up. If something happens in this mansion, you do not involve yourself further. The statement should have sounded protective. Instead, it sounded like a man already anticipating collapse. Elena held his gaze calmly. You think this ends with someone entering your room? He looked at her carefully. It doesn't. The honesty in her voice unsettled him because he already knew she was right. The room was never the real target. The goal was larger now. Victor handling meetings. Security changing procedures. Doctors adjusting medication. Conversations lowering when he entered rooms. Everyone adapting carefully to a version of him becoming less reliable. A sharp knock interrupted the office. Before either of them answered, the door opened. Victor entered first. Then the head of security behind him. Both men stopped very slightly when they saw Elena still inside. Only slightly, but enough. Victor recovered first with an easy expression. You're still awake. The Mafia Boss gave a tired glance toward the untouched coffee beside the desk. That seems to concern everyone lately. Victor smiled faintly, though the warmth never fully reached his eyes. You canceled tomorrow's meeting. I postponed it. Victor stepped farther inside. The investors flew in from Chicago. They can fly back. The air inside the office tightened subtly. Not confrontation. Pressure. The head of security remained near the doorway. Silent and composed. Watching, Victor rested one hand lightly against the back of a chair. You've barely slept in days. And now you monitor my sleep too. That isn't fair. No. The Mafia Boss said quietly. What's happening here isn't fair. Victor's expression changed then. Not anger. Concern. Which somehow felt worse. Elena could no longer tell where genuine concern ended, and structural adaptation began. Victor lowered his voice. No one is against you. The Mafia Boss gave a tired smile without humor. That sentence usually appears right before people stop telling the truth. The room fell silent. Elena remained near the side table. Invisible in the way staff members often became during family tension. But invisibility had its own dangers. People forgot what she could hear. Victor eventually looked toward her. You can leave the tray. Elena nodded once. As she crossed toward the door, she noticed the head of security shift slightly aside to let her pass. Professional. Polite. But his eyes dropped briefly toward the folded outage paper still resting on the desk. Just for a second, then back to her. That was enough. He had seen it. Elena understood immediately that the room had changed again. Until now, she had been someone observing patterns quietly from the edges of the mansion. Now someone else knew she was observing too. She left the office without hurrying. Fast movement attracted attention inside powerful houses. Calm people survived longer. The hallway outside remained empty, except for the low hum of recessed lighting and distant rain beginning again against the upper windows. Elena walked toward the elevator slowly, then stopped. The hallway camera above the office corridor had gone dark again. Not flickering. Not broken. Off. She stared at the dead red light for several long seconds. Then she looked back toward the office door behind her. The outage had started while Victor and the head of security were inside the room, which meant one of two things. Either the timing was impossible, or someone inside the mansion no longer cared whether the pattern was noticed. The next 3 nights changed the mansion more than the previous 3 weeks had. Not visibly. No alarms. No missing guards. No broken locks. Only small adjustments. Victor began sitting at the head of more meetings. Not officially. Just practically. The physician started arriving twice a day instead of once. Security reduced unnecessary staff movement near the West Wing to preserve quiet. And the Mafia Boss stopped correcting people when they spoke around him carefully. That frightened Elena most of all, because exhaustion had finally begun changing his behavior. Not only his sleep. One evening she entered the office carrying fresh coffee and found him staring at a contract for nearly a full minute without turning the page. Not distracted. Drained. The lamp beside him cast deep shadows beneath his eyes now. His shirts remained wrinkled longer. His hands moved slower. Even his silences had changed. Before, his silence felt controlled. Now it felt expensive. "You should eat something," Elena said softly. He did not look up immediately. Victor already said that. That doesn't make it wrong. A tired breath almost became a laugh. Almost. She set the tray down near the desk and noticed another untouched cup from earlier, still sitting cold beside the window. "You're shaking," she said quietly. That made him finally look at his own hand. Only then did he seem to notice it. A small tremor. Barely visible. But once seen, impossible to ignore. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he leaned back slowly and covered his eyes with one hand. "I don't know what's worse anymore," he said. "The intrusion. No." His voice lowered. "The possibility that everyone around me is starting to believe I can't trust my own mind." The honesty in the room felt heavier than fear had. Elena understood then that sleep deprivation was no longer the central danger. Isolation was. Every explanation around him translated his experience into instability. The longer that continued, the more impossible it became to defend himself without sounding exactly like the exhausted man they already believed he was becoming. He removed his hand from his eyes and looked toward the dark office windows. "Do you know what happens in organizations like this when people begin doubting the judgment of the person in charge?" Elena stayed still. He answered anyway. "They stop waiting for certainty." Outside. Rain slid slowly down the glass. "Victor thinks he's helping," he continued. "That's the dangerous part. Not hatred. Not ambition spoken aloud. Practical adaptation. That was what made it difficult to fight. Everyone around him could still convince themselves they were being reasonable. The physician adjusting medication. Security modifying schedules. Victor reducing pressure. Meetings being postponed. None of it looked like betrayal individually. Together, it looked like preparation. Elena watched him carefully. For the first time since this began, he sounded tired enough to surrender to the narrative forming around him. "You were right," she said quietly. He looked at her immediately. "About what someone is doing this intentionally." The words landed differently now than they would have weeks earlier. Not theory anymore. Recognition. Elena crossed slowly toward the desk. The outages. The patrol changes. The room being restored afterward. She shook her head slightly. "That isn't confusion. It's management." His eyes narrowed faintly at the word. Management. Not attack. Not chaos. Control. The Mafia Boss leaned back again. Exhausted. "And what exactly are they waiting for?" Elena looked at him for several long seconds before answering. "I don't think they're waiting." The room went still, because both of them understood the implication immediately. This was not preparation for future collapse. The collapse itself had already started. A soft knock interrupted them. The physician entered carrying another medication case. He stopped when he saw Elena still there. Though this time the hesitation lasted longer. Not irritation. Awareness. As if he had started understanding her role inside the room had changed. You should rest, the doctor said gently to the Mafia Boss. The Mafia Boss gave a faint glance toward the medication case. You've said that every night. And every night you ignore me. Because every night someone enters my room. The physician closed the case slowly without opening it. The movement looked almost sad. Elena, the doctor said carefully. Would you give us a moment? Before she could answer. The Mafia Boss spoke first. She stays. The room shifted instantly after that. Quietly. Permanently. The physician noticed it. Elena noticed it. Even the Mafia Boss seemed aware of what he had just revealed. Not authority. Preference. Trust. The physician lowered himself into the chair opposite the desk. You haven't slept properly in over a week. And yet the cameras only fail between 1 and 3 in the morning. The physician hesitated. Security explained the outages. No. The Mafia Boss replied softly. Security described them. The distinction lingered. The physician removed his glasses briefly, rubbing exhaustion from his eyes. Elena, he said without looking at her. Have you personally seen anyone enter the room? The question mattered because it sounded reasonable. That was how this mansion worked now. Truth became trapped beneath reasonable doubt. No. Elena answered honestly. Then you understand why everyone is concerned. Concerned. Again that word. Gentle. Clean. Never honest enough to describe what was actually happening. Elena looked at the physician carefully. For the first time, she realized he was frightened too. Not of violence. Of uncertainty. A doctor could survive danger more easily than ambiguity. And deep down, he had started recognizing something he no longer knew how to explain medically. You think he's imagining patterns? Elena said quietly. The physician answered slowly. I think exhaustion changes perception. And if the perception is correct, the physician fell silent. That silence mattered more than any argument could have. For the first time, he did not immediately dismiss the possibility. The Mafia Boss noticed it too. Elena saw something shift faintly in his expression then. Not relief. Validation. Small. Fragile. But real. The physician stood after a long moment. I'll return tomorrow. He left the medication case unopened on the desk before walking toward the door. Just before exiting, he paused slightly and looked back toward the Mafia Boss. Try to sleep anyway. After he left, the office suddenly felt larger. The Mafia Boss stared at the unopened medication case. You know what the worst part is? He asked eventually. Elena waited. If they wanted me dead, he stopped briefly, eyes lowering toward his own unsteady hand. This would almost be kinder. The sentence settled into the room like something already broken, because Elena finally understood the true cruelty of what was happening. Murder ended authority immediately. This was slower. A systematic dismantling of trust. Not only his trust in others, everyone else's trust in him. The Mafia Boss closed his eyes briefly and leaned back against the chair. For the first time since Elena had known him, he looked truly tired enough to disappear into sleep against his will. That frightened her more than any moved object ever had. She crossed quietly toward the office door, then stopped. Something near the bookshelf caught her attention. A reflection. Small. Almost invisible. One of the decorative glass frames beside the shelf reflected part of the office doorway behind them. And in that reflection, Elena realized something cold. The hallway camera outside the office was recording again. New alert? No explanation. Just a tiny red light returned to life after the doctor had gone. After that night, Elena stopped trying to decide who inside the mansion was responsible. The question no longer mattered in the same way. The truth had become larger than one person. The system itself was participating now. A camera shutting off at the correct hour. A patrol route shifting without explanation. A meeting reassigned for his health. A physician encouraged to prioritize rest over certainty. None of it looked violent. That was why it worked. The mafia boss understood it too. Elena saw the realization settle deeper into him over the following days. He stopped questioning individual incidents one at a time. Stopped asking whether the slippers moved or the lamp changed or the curtains opened. He had finally recognized the pattern beneath all of it. The longer he stayed awake, the easier it became to doubt him. The mansion adapted quickly after that. Victor began handling nearly all outside meetings. The head of security stopped offering detailed explanations entirely. Even the staff changed around him. Not intentionally cruel. Careful. People lowered their voices near the West Wing. Conversations paused slightly when he entered rooms. Guards watched him the way medical personnel watched unstable patients in expensive clinics. The mafia boss noticed every part of it. That was the final cruelty. They were not trying to make him unaware. They wanted him aware enough to feel himself becoming isolated in real time. One night, Elena entered the office shortly after 2 a.m. and found him sitting in darkness except for the desk lamp near the whiskey glass he had not touched. He was no longer pretending to work. The files remained closed now. Exhaustion had stripped away performance. "You should turn on the lights," she said softly. He looked toward the office windows instead. "I wanted to see if the camera outside shuts off when the room is dark." Elena stayed quiet. And it did. The answer settled between them heavily. Confirmed. The mafia boss leaned back slowly in the chair. "They're becoming careless." "No," Elena replied. "They think the result is already happening." He looked at her carefully after that. Not because she was wrong. Because she had said aloud the thing nobody else in the mansion would. He no longer needed to be removed physically. He only needed to appear unstable long enough for everyone around him to reorganize without resistance. The office fell quiet again. Then the mafia boss spoke in a voice lower than she had heard before. "My father used to say power rarely disappears in one moment." His eyes remained on the dark window glass. "Usually people begin surviving around your weakness before they abandon you entirely." The sentence carried no anger. Only fatigue. And beneath the fatigue, recognition. He understood now that the intrusions had never truly been about fear. Fear was only the method. The real objective was emotional erosion. Weeks without sleep. Weeks of reasonable explanations. Weeks of careful concern. Long enough for everyone around him to slowly stop treating his perception as reliable. He lowered his eyes briefly toward his own trembling hand. They chose something impossible to defend against. Elena moved closer to the desk. "You defended it." "No." He gave a faint, tired shake of his head. "You noticed it." That mattered more. Inside the mansion, observation had become the only loyalty he could still recognize. Not loyalty to power. To reality. The realization changed something between them permanently. Not romance. Something quieter. The kind of trust exhausted people develop toward whoever helps them feel sane again. Outside the office, distant footsteps crossed the upper hallway and faded. Neither of them looked toward the sound immediately anymore. The mafia boss had spent weeks reacting to every movement in the mansion. Now he looked tired beyond vigilance. And somehow that frightened Elena more. People eventually collapse, not when fear becomes strongest, but when exhaustion becomes heavier than fear itself. She noticed the unopened medication case still resting near the edge of the desk. Even the physician had stopped insisting as aggressively now. Everyone inside the mansion was adjusting their expectations downward. Slowly. Humanely. As though preparing the mafia boss for a smaller version of his own authority. Elena looked toward the office door. "Do you trust Victor?" The question lingered carefully in the room. The mafia boss answered after a long pause. "I trust that he believes he's being reasonable. Not innocence. Not guilt. Something more dangerous. Conviction." Victor did not need to hate him for this system to continue. He only needed to accept it gradually. Like everyone else. The mafia boss closed his eyes briefly and rested his head against the chair. "For weeks," he said quietly. I thought someone was trying to enter my room. He opened his eyes again slowly. But they already entered the only place that mattered. Elena understood immediately. Not the bedroom. Perception. Trust. Authority. Those had been the real targets from the beginning. Then Elena noticed something small near the edge of the desk. A security folder left partially open beneath the reports. Probably forgotten by Victor earlier that evening. Inside, one page listed temporary patrol adjustments for the West Wing. The times matched the outage windows almost exactly. Not hidden. Not secret. Administrative. That was the final confirmation. The blind periods were not accidents anymore. They had become procedure. Elena looked up slowly toward the Mafia boss. He saw her expression immediately. What is it? She hesitated only briefly before sliding the folder toward him. His eyes moved across the page once, then stopped. No anger crossed his face. No dramatic realization. Only something colder. Acceptance. Because the paper proved what exhaustion had already taught him emotionally. The system around him had stopped protecting certainty. It was protecting transition. The Mafia boss closed the folder carefully and rested one hand over it. For the first time since Elena had known him, he looked truly alone. Not isolated by fear, separated by understanding. Because once a powerful man realizes people are reorganizing around his instability, every kindness begins feeling procedural. After a long silence, he finally looked toward her. Why did you stay? The question surprised her because he sounded as though he genuinely no longer understood why anyone would. Elena thought about answering carefully. Instead, she answered honestly, because you were telling the truth. The room became still enough for the sentence to matter completely. The Mafia boss lowered his eyes for a moment, and Elena realized then that the intrusions had failed in one important way. They had exhausted him, isolated him, reshaped the mansion around him. But they had not fully convinced him he was alone anymore. Outside the office, dawn had started turning the eastern windows faintly blue. For the first time in weeks, the Mafia boss looked toward the bedroom without visible fear. Not because the mansion had become safe, because someone else finally understood what had been done to him. That night, the Mafia boss finally entered the bedroom before sunrise. Not because the mansion felt safe again. It did not. The cameras still watched the same hallways. The guards still rotated through the West Wing. Victor still handled meetings downstairs with careful calm. And somewhere inside the estate, people were still adjusting themselves around the possibility of his decline. None of that disappeared. But something else had changed. For weeks, every room inside the mansion had been trying to convince him that his fear was exhaustion, that his instincts were becoming unreliable, that his mind was slowly separating from reality. And eventually, even he had started believing it. Until one quiet housemaid looked at moved slippers, dead cameras, altered patrols, and carefully restored rooms, and said the thing nobody else would say aloud. You were telling the truth. The Mafia boss stood beside the bed for a long moment, before sitting down slowly. The room remained perfectly arranged tonight. The lamp aligned correctly. The curtains closed. The water glass untouched. Nothing looked wrong. That no longer comforted him, because now he understood the real danger had never been hidden inside the room itself. It had been hidden inside the way people reacted to his fear. Elena remained outside the bedroom door while the rest of the mansion slept. Not guarding him with weapons, just staying. Sometimes emotional safety begins in very small ways. A person who listens carefully, a person who notices, a person who refuses to let fear become madness simply because powerful people say it should. Near dawn, the bedroom lights finally went dark. No alarm sounded. No confrontation happened. The mansion remained quiet. And for the first time in weeks, the Mafia boss slept. Not peacefully, not fully, but enough for his breathing to slow. Enough for his hands to stop trembling. Enough for someone outside the door to realize that exhaustion had almost done what violence could not. It had almost convinced a man he was completely alone. Rain began again just before morning, soft against the windows. Inside the West Wing, Elena sat quietly beneath the dim hallway light, while the estate continued breathing around her in silence. The cameras watched the corridor again. The guards continued their rotations. The mansion still belonged to dangerous people. But somewhere inside that darkness, one person had finally stopped doubting himself. And sometimes, inside houses built on fear, that is the closest thing to safety anyone ever gets.